You have until tomorrow to pack your things and leave." My daughter-in-law Carmen's words echoed through the living room like thunder. My living room. My house. From the armchair, my granddaughter Olivia stared at me with a cold smile, her teenage eyes showing not a trace of compassion. "Grandma, you were never really my grandmother. You were only Dad's mother, nothing more." Each word pierced me like a knife. I had changed that girl's diapers, made her favorite pancakes, rocked her to sleep, and now she looked at me as if I were a stranger, an intruder. My son, Robert, the man for whom I had sacrificed everything after his father's death, was standing there, silent. He did not defend me. He said nothing, and that silence hurt more than all of Carmen and Olivia's cruel words together. I had just turned 70 years of life dedicated to this family and to this house. Now Carmen waved papers in front of me as if they were the final sentence. "Look, Theodora, Robert has already transferred the deed. This property is in my name." Her smile was pure poison. "You were never more than a guest here, and we don't need you anymore." The tears burned, but I swallowed them down. I would not give them that pleasure. I thought they could not wound me any further. But that night showed me betrayal went far beyond words. It wasn't always like this. Just 3 years ago, Robert and Olivia came over every Sunday. Olivia's eyes would sparkle when I pulled from the oven the mac and cheese she loved so much. Carmen hugged me and called me Mom, with a sweetness I now know was all pretend. But after my sister Margaret passed away and left this house to me, everything started to change. Suddenly, Robert had questions about inheritance, deeds, wills. Carmen became overly attentive, rummaging through drawers, asking where I kept banking documents. Daily calls turned weekly, then bi-weekly, until they stopped. Family dinners turned into veiled criticism. "Mom, maybe you should change your look a little. Robert deserves a more modern mother." Robert chewed in silence while she dismantled my dignity. Even Olivia changed. Lukewarm hugs, no desire to spend weekends with me. "I don't like this food anymore, Grandma. It's greasy, outdated." It was a slow erosion until the day I overheard something that froze me inside. I was watering my plants when the wind carried voices from the kitchen. It was Carmen, whispering, "The deed is in the top drawer. I checked when she went out last week." And Robert's reply, "Are you sure it's going to work?" In that moment, I realized this wasn't just disdain. It was a plan, and I was the target. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words I had heard echoed like alarm bells. "The deed is in the top drawer. Are you sure it's going to work?" My heart pounded so hard it felt like they could hear it from the kitchen. From that moment on, I began to watch every detail. Carmen always arrived smiling, but her eyes never rested. They scanned shelves, closets, documents. "I just want to help you get more organized, Mom," she said. But I noticed how her hands lingered too long over each envelope, how she tried to cover it up whenever I entered the room. Olivia had changed too. She no longer ran to my lap, no longer called me Grandma with affection. Instead, she asked strange questions. "Grandma, do you have a safe at home? Where do you keep the bank papers?" Pretending curiosity, but only repeating what her mother told her to ask. Robert, for his part, came with rehearsed tones. "Mom, do you remember how you got this house? Do you have all the documents?" When I asked why he wanted to know, he replied, "Carmen and I are organizing our finances. It's important to have everything documented." Organizing finances, or organizing my eviction? That night, I went through the drawers and confirmed. The deeds were there, untouched. My name written in full. Theodora Williams, legal and sole owner. Relief lasted only seconds, until doubt crept back. What papers was Carmen waving in front of me? If hers were fake, how could she be so confident? The following weeks were torment. Carmen would show up with papers, to sign. It's just a routine procedure. Robert needs it for taxes. I skimmed them, but her rush to have me sign set off every alarm. I started politely refusing, making up excuses. One afternoon, I walked into my room and found her going through my closet. "I'm looking for aspirin, Mom. I have a headache." But there was no medicine in that closet, only documents. She blushed, mumbled something, and hurried out. That was when I realized they were testing me, slowly trying to confuse me, to make me believe I no longer had control of my own life. What they didn't know was that I had already decided to arm myself. If they wanted to play dirty, I would gather evidence, and I would start with the law. I got up early on a Wednesday morning and went to the bank where I had held an account for 20 years. The manager, Laura Smith, had known me since I was young. "Mrs. Williams, what a pleasure to see you. What can I do for you today?" I looked her straight in the eye. "I need to review every detail of my accounts, transactions, authorizations, beneficiaries, everything." Laura gave me a worried look. "Are you suspecting something irregular?" "I suspect my own family," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. She typed into the system and soon shook her head. "Everything is in order. You remain the sole account holder. No additional access has been authorized." A weight lifted from my chest. At least the money was still safe. I asked her to place a note. No one could touch my accounts without my physical presence. From the bank, I went to the county notary office. The old Dr. Harris, a respected notary, received me immediately. "Mrs. Williams, how can I help you?" "I need to confirm that this house is still registered solely in my name." He requested the documents, reviewed them, and smiled calmly. "Yes, ma'am. The property has been in your exclusive name since the day you inherited it from your sister. No changes recorded." "And if someone shows up with different documents?" I asked. "They would be false. And that is serious fraud, punishable by prison." I left with notarized copies in hand, my weapon. I also stopped at the county clerk's office to obtain an official property record certificate. The clerk, a young woman named Veronica, confirmed, "There are no changes or processes in progress. You remain the sole owner." I returned home with an organized folder: notarized deed, registry certificate, bank statements. As I climbed the stairs, Carmen stopped me in the hallway. "Mom, where were you so early? Need help with anything?" Her smile was far too wide. "No, dear, nothing you can help me with." For the first time, I saw a flicker of nervousness in her eyes, and I understood. My silence was now my greatest weapon. The following days were a cruel spectacle within my own walls. Robert came home from work with new bags, expensive clothes, shiny shoes, electronic devices he spread across the living room. "I got a raise," he said, but his eyes avoided mine. Carmen, triumphant, was already talking about replacing curtains, tearing down walls, turning my garden into artificial turf. "These old plants are just work, Mom. A pool would be much better here." Each word was a stab. Those roses, which I had planted the same year Robert was born, were my living history. Olivia also paraded the territory as if it were hers. She brought friends to see the future home of my family. In the hallway, I overheard her proud voice. "My grandma is moving into a nursing home. Soon this will all be ours." Carmen photographed the rooms, inventing excuses. "It's for insurance. Robert wants to update the policy." But I knew. She was cataloging every object, deciding what would stay and what would be discarded. The nights were even worse. I heard whispers in the kitchen, plans for renovations, discussions about loans and investments they would make once the house was in their name. Robert spoke of new businesses. Carmen dreamed of a life without limitations. And I, upstairs, clutched my folder with the real documents like a shield. One afternoon, Olivia brought a boy to study. Trash scattered, loud music, insolent footsteps. When I asked them to lower the volume, she looked at me with contempt. "Relax, Grandma. Soon you won't have to put up with any of this." While they celebrated, I watered my plants in the backyard and promised myself that when the time came, they would be the ones packing their bags. What they didn't imagine was that while they toasted an early victory, I already had in my hands all the evidence that would turn their party into a funeral. On the afternoon Carmen had set as my final deadline, they staged an improvised tribunal in the living room. My own sofa became a throne of arrogance. Carmen presided over the farce with theatrical posture. Robert held papers with trembling hands. Olivia filmed everything on her phone as if it were a historic event. "Theodora, sit down. We need to talk about your future." "Have you packed your things, Grandma?" Olivia mocked. "The deadline is up." Carmen spread the false documents across the table. "Take a good look. Robert transferred this house to me 6 months ago. I have every right to demand you leave." I picked up the sheets. At first glance they seemed official, but the details screamed forgery. Smudged seals, nonsensical dates, poorly copied signatures. "Where did these papers come from, Carmen?" She lifted her chin. "From a competent lawyer. Everything is in order." Robert shifted in his chair, unable to sustain the lie. "What lawyer?" I pressed. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. I stood up slowly and went upstairs. Behind me, I heard Olivia whisper, "Where's she going?" "Probably to get her bags," Carmen answered, certain of victory. When I returned, I carried my folder. I placed it on the table, pulling out the original documents one by one. Notarized deed, county registry certificate, bank statements. Each sheet was a bomb exploding in their confidence. "This is the only valid deed," I declared. "Notarized, registered at the county clerk. No transfer has ever occurred. The house is still mine." The silence was so heavy that even the ticking clock sounded like thunder. And in that instant, I saw the first crack on Carmen's face. For the first time, she doubted her own game. Carmen was the first to react. She jumped up from the sofa, her voice raised, trying to regain control. "This proves nothing. We can challenge it. You're no longer in full possession of your faculties, Theodora. A woman your age cannot manage a house alone." Her attempt to discredit me only revealed her desperation. Calmly, I opened another envelope and slid it across the table. "This is a report from my bank confirming that I am in full mental and financial capacity. Just yesterday, I signed in-person protocols. If you try to accuse me of incompetence, you'll have to face not only the law but official institutions." Robert dropped the papers he was holding. His facade of blind obedience began to crumble. "Mother, this can't be true." Carmen said, "Always, Carmen." "But when was the last time you checked anything yourself, Robert? When did you stop thinking with your own head?" Olivia stopped recording. The phone slipped from her hand, landing on the carpet. "This is impossible," she whispered, eyes wide. Carmen's mask fell. "It's not impossible. It's unfair. This house should rightfully belong to Robert. You're just an old woman clinging to the past. We deserve to start our life here." The words fell like poison into the air. Robert tried to intervene, but Carmen silenced him with a piercing look. Suddenly, the pretense of a united family turned into open war. "You know what this means, don't you?" My voice came out serene, almost cold. "It means that from now on, every step you take can be reported as fraud, and fraud against the elderly in this country leads to prison." Carmen stepped back, but still tried a last strike. "Then we'll tell everyone. We'll say you threw your own family out. Let's see what the neighbors will think of you." I felt an involuntary smile form on my lips. "Tell the truth, Carmen. Tell them you tried to rob your grandmother and she defended herself. Let's see who the neighborhood supports." And for an instant, fear flashed across her face like a blade under the light. That night, the house was filled with muffled voices behind closed doors. I could hear Robert and Carmen arguing, their words sharp and bitter, clashing like knives. Accusations flew back and forth, objects clattered to the floor, and Olivia's sobs echoed faintly through the hallway. She had locked herself in her room, no longer brave enough to repeat the cruel lines she had spoken that morning. When dawn broke, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I went down to the kitchen, where Carmen stood hunched over the counter. She was no longer the confident, arrogant woman who had paraded her false triumph through my living room. Her hair was messy, her face pale, and her eyes were swollen from sleepless tears. She clutched a cup of cold coffee with both hands, as if trying to hold herself together. "We need to talk, Theodora," she said, in a tone that wavered between demand and plea. "About what?" I answered, steady. "About the fraud, about the theft." It was a misunderstanding," she stammered. "Robert truly believed this house, that maybe—" "A misunderstanding doesn't involve forged documents, Carmen. A misunderstanding doesn't plot to throw a 70-year-old woman out of her own home." She flinched at my words. For the first time, I saw not arrogance, but panic in her eyes. Moments later, Robert entered. He looked broken. His beard was unshaven, his shirt wrinkled, deep shadows under his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, avoiding my gaze like a schoolboy who had been caught cheating. "Mother," he finally whispered, "forgive me. I don't know what I was thinking." "Oh, I know exactly what you were thinking," I replied without raising my eyes from the coffee I poured. "You were thinking of money, of inheritance, of how to get rid of me as if I were nothing more than a burden." Robert winced. Carmen lowered her head, and then Olivia appeared at the foot of the stairs. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as if each one dragged a weight too heavy for her young shoulders. She looked nothing like the bold teenager who had mocked me days earlier. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Grandma, I didn't know it was this bad. Mom told me you weren't well, that you needed help, that you couldn't manage anymore." I sighed, heavy and tired. "And you believed her without ever looking me in the eyes, without ever asking me if it was true." Her tears fell freely. "I only wanted to make Mom happy. She said it was for our future. I thought maybe it wouldn't hurt if you moved to a better place." I held her hand for a moment. It was small and trembling. "Olivia, you're old enough to know that you don't steal from your grandmother. You repeated cruel words. You stuffed my things into bags as if they were trash. Do you realize what that means?" She lowered her gaze. "It means I failed as a granddaughter, that I hurt the person who always cared for me." Her confession cut deep. For a moment, I wanted to embrace her, to tell her everything would be all right. But the wound was still raw, and forgiveness could not come so easily. "Words are not enough, Olivia. Forgiveness does not come from tears, but from choices. And so far, your choices have shown me only contempt." She sobbed, her shoulders trembling. "I don't want to lose you, Grandma. I don't want to be remembered as the granddaughter who betrayed you." Behind her, Robert collapsed into a chair. His hands shook as he rubbed his face. Carmen, desperate, tried to shift the blame once more. "We can't leave, Theodora. We have nowhere to go. Robert lost his job last week. This house was our only chance to start over." The truth spilled out like cold water, stripping away the last of their pretenses. Robert's head hung in shame. So that was the real motive, not just greed, but despair. But instead of coming to me with honesty, they had chosen deceit. "If you had asked me with sincerity, perhaps I would have helped," I said, my voice steady. "But you preferred lies. You chose to forge papers. You chose to humiliate me." Robert's eyes filled with tears. Maybe we can still fix this." "No," I cut him off. The chance to act as family ended the day you acted like thieves. The kitchen fell silent. Olivia wept softly. Carmen stared at the floor, and Robert sat with his shame. And I realized then, there were no longer ties of love binding us together, only the cold, hard line of justice. The morning after the storm in the living room, I stepped outside early to water my roses. The air felt heavier than usual, as if it carried whispers rather than oxygen. I could sense it in the way the curtains across the street moved slightly, in the way footsteps paused whenever I opened the gate. Mrs. Miller's kind voice from the day before still rang in my memory, but now the atmosphere was different. This time, it wasn't just one neighbor watching, it was the entire block. As I bent down to water a cluster of crimson roses, I noticed Mrs. Parker, who had always greeted me warmly, crossing to her mailbox. Our eyes met for a brief second. Normally, she would smile, wave, and perhaps even walk over to chat about the weather. Instead, she lowered her head quickly and shuffled back inside. Mr. Johnson, standing by his fence trimming hedges, lifted a hand in greeting. But it was half-hearted, lacking the firm warmth I had known for decades. His gaze lingered for only a moment before slipping away. Something had shifted. Carmen's poison had begun to seep into the soil of this community. By mid-morning, the phone rang. Mrs. Miller's voice trembled through the receiver. "Theodora, I have to tell you something. Carmen came by yesterday evening. She told people you'd lost your mind, that you invented fake documents, that you were trying to throw Robert out of the house. She's trying to turn everyone against you." My stomach tightened. It wasn't enough for her to try to take my home. She wanted my dignity, too. I decided not to hide. Shame only grows in the dark. So I walked to the corner where two women, neighbors I had known for years, were whispering. As soon as they saw me, their conversation broke off abruptly. Their faces stiffened. "Is it true you expelled Robert?" one of them asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would curse her. I stood tall, meeting her eyes. "I didn't expel anyone. I defended myself against fraud. I have official documents that prove it." They exchanged uneasy glances. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and I could see the roots threatening to spread. That afternoon, I heard the sound of car doors slamming. I looked out the window and saw Carmen stepping out with two of her friends. Their laughter was loud, deliberate, meant to draw attention. They strutted into my living room without knocking, their perfume trailing like an invasion. "Look, girls," Carmen said, her voice dripping with mockery. "This is the queen of drama. She claims we're criminals just because she can't admit she's losing her mind." My hands trembled, but I held them together, breathing slowly. I knew what was at stake wasn't just four walls, it was my honor, my truth, and the way this neighborhood would remember me. I looked at Carmen's friends. Their smiles faltered as their eyes darted around the room. They weren't laughing anymore. They were measuring, evaluating, questioning silently. Gossip is powerful, but so is doubt. That evening, I sat in my bedroom and stared at the folder on my desk, the documents, notarized and stamped, lying there like soldiers ready for battle. I realized then that Carmen had declared war not only in my home, but in the streets outside. She wanted to claim my place in the community, to isolate me, to twist my story before I could speak it. But I would not let her. I would not allow whispers to define me. If she wanted a theater, I would choose the stage myself. I would gather the neighbors, not as spectators, but as witnesses. For the first time in weeks, I felt resolve harden within me. Carmen believed that age made me invisible, that the word of a 70-year-old woman would crumble under her charm and lies. She underestimated the strength of truth spoken in daylight. As I closed the curtains that night, I understood something. My fight was no longer just inside these walls. It had spilled into the gardens, across fences, into the hearts of people who had known me for years, and it was there, under the watchful eyes of the neighborhood, that the final battle would be decided. The next morning, Carmen entered the kitchen carrying a sleek black folder under her arm, her heels striking the wooden floor like drumbeats of arrogance. She placed the folder on the table with a deliberate thud, as if presenting evidence in a courtroom she had invented for herself. "The lawyer said we can file a petition to have you declared legally incompetent, Theodora," she announced, her voice sharp but trembling at the edges. "That way, you won't have to worry about anything. We'll take care of it all." She spoke as though it were a kindness, as if stripping me of my rights was some sort of gift. But that single word, incompetent, echoed in my ears like a prison sentence. Robert sat at the table, shoulders slouched, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. He didn't dare look at me. "It's for the best, Mom," he muttered. "You shouldn't be living alone anymore." Calmly, I set down my teacup and opened my own folder. From inside, I pulled out a crisp document and placed it directly beside Carmen's black case. "This," I said, tapping the page with my finger, "is a medical certificate from the bank's official physician, issued just yesterday. It confirms my full cognitive and financial capacity. If you try to strip me of my rights, you'll have to battle not just me, but the institutions that stand with me." The color drained slightly from Robert's face. His fingers tightened around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. Carmen pressed her lips together, refusing to admit defeat. "Then we'll go another way," she hissed. "We'll tell the neighbors who you really are, that you threw your own family out for no reason. Do you think anyone likes a bitter old woman? They'll see you for what you are." But before her venom could linger in the air, the doorbell rang. I smiled inwardly. I knew who it was. Mrs. Miller stood at the door, holding a cake tin covered in a checkered cloth. "Oh, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said politely, though her eyes quickly scanned the room. "I just brought a cake for Theodora." "Perfect timing," I said warmly, guiding her inside. "You arrived at just the right moment. They were just telling me they intend to have me declared incompetent." Mrs. Miller's eyes widened. She looked at Carmen, then at Robert, then at Olivia, who stood awkwardly in the corner, clutching her phone. Carmen gave a nervous laugh, too shrill to sound genuine. "She's confused," she said quickly. "It's all a misunderstanding." But Mrs. Miller's expression hardened. She didn't believe a word. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "This is ridiculous. We don't need to explain ourselves to anyone," he shouted, though his voice shook with fear rather than authority. Olivia lowered her phone, unable to record anymore. For once, she seemed ashamed. Carmen snapped the folder shut with a sharp motion, but the frustration in her eyes betrayed her. Her attempt to dominate had faltered, not because of me, but because of the presence of an outsider. She had counted on whispers in the dark. She hadn't prepared for truth in the daylight. In that moment, I realized what her true strategy had been. It wasn't just about forged papers or false signatures. It was about reputation. She wanted to strip me not only of my home, but of the respect I carried in this community. She wanted the neighborhood to see me as weak, delusional, bitter. But the shot had backfired, because now I had a witness, and not just any witness, one who was respected, trusted, and already suspicious of Carmen's schemes. Mrs. Miller's silence spoke louder than Carmen's accusations. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It had begun to spread, steady and unstoppable. As Mrs. Miller handed me the cake, her hand lingered for a second, squeezing mine gently. Her eyes said what her lips did not. "I believe you. You are not alone." Mrs. Miller's presence that morning had been like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread silently through the house, touching every corner. Carmen locked herself in the bedroom with her phone, pacing and whispering furiously to whoever was on the other end. Olivia slipped out the front door with hurried steps, as if escaping a storm she no longer wanted to face. But Robert stayed. He remained in the living room, slumped in an armchair that seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't move for hours. The man who had once strutted through this house with false authority now looked like a statue, cracked, brittle, waiting for the final break. I sat in my own armchair, across from him, the same chair where I had mended socks, read bedtime stories, and nursed colds when he was a boy. Now, from that chair, I studied the man he had become. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled slightly on his knees, his breath came in uneven waves. "Robert," I said softly, but firmly, "when did you stop being my son and start being your wife's accomplice?" He didn't answer. His lips pressed together, his jaw clenched. I could see him fighting something inside, a battle of shame and pride. Minutes passed, heavy and slow. Then, finally, he lifted his eyes to meet mine. They were wet, shimmering with a guilt he could no longer hide. "Mother," his voice cracked, "I never wanted it to come to this." My heart tightened. For the first time in months, I heard his voice without Carmen's shadow lurking behind it. It was his voice alone, stripped of excuses. "Then why, Robert?" I pressed. "Why did you let forged papers cross this table? Why did you treat me like a burden, as if I were in the way of your life?" He ran both hands over his face, dragging down the mask he had worn for so long. "I lost my job 6 months ago. I couldn't tell you. The bills piled up. Olivia's school, the car loan, the groceries. I was drowning. Carmen said the house would solve everything, that it made sense since you live here alone. She said it was logical, practical. And He broke off, his voice failing. "And you believed her?" I asked, my tone sharper now. He nodded, shame flushing his cheeks. "I convinced myself it would be temporary, that you wouldn't suffer, that we could fix it later. I thought if I just kept going, it would all make sense in the end." I swallowed hard. In front of me was not only my son, but also the stranger he had become. The boy I had raised, the young man who once carried groceries for me without being asked, who once ran across the yard laughing in the rain. He was still there, buried under layers of desperation and cowardice. But I couldn't reach him anymore. "You deceived yourself, Robert," I said slowly. "More than me, you deceived yourself, and now look where it has brought you." Tears welled in his eyes. He leaned forward suddenly, sliding from the chair to the floor, as if his knees could no longer hold him. He knelt before me like a penitent child, hands shaking. "Mother, please forgive me. I am your son. I always will be. Don't abandon me. Don't turn away." Once, long ago, that gesture might have melted me. I might have reached down, lifted him up, told him everything would be fine, but not now. Now it felt rehearsed, desperate, a man cornered by his own conscience rather than a son seeking true reconciliation. I looked at him, my chest heavy with sorrow. "Forgiveness, Robert, is not a word. It is a path, and you chose another path. You let greed, fear, and weakness guide your steps. I cannot walk them back for you." His sobs filled the room, low and broken. And I knew with piercing clarity, a son may repent, but trust, once shattered, never returns whole. By late afternoon, Olivia returned. She came in slowly, eyes swollen, her face marked by tears. "Grandma, can we talk?" I nodded, though part of me wanted to send her straight upstairs. She sat on the edge of the sofa, like she used to as a child, but her posture now was one of shame. "I didn't know it was this serious," she began. "Mom said you weren't well, that you needed help, that you couldn't manage the house." I sighed deeply. "And you believed her without ever looking into my eyes, without ever asking yourself if it was true?" Tears streamed down her face. "I just wanted to please Mom. She said it was for our future. I thought it wouldn't matter if you went to live in a better place." I held her hand for a moment. It was fragile, trembling. "Olivia, you're 18, old enough to know you don't steal from your own grandmother. You repeated cruel words. You threw my things into bags as if they were trash. Do you know what that means? She lowered her head. It means I failed as a granddaughter, that I hurt the person who always cared for me. Those words cut deep. Part of me wanted to hug her, to say everything would be all right. But another part, the one still bleeding from humiliation, could not. Words are not enough, Olivia. Forgiveness doesn't come from tears, but from choices. And so far, your choices have shown me contempt. She sobbed. I don't want to lose you, Grandma. I don't want to be remembered as the granddaughter who betrayed you. I remained silent for a long time, watching that girl torn between the weight of youth and her parents' shadow. And I understood there might be hope for her, but only if she chose to walk on her own. You still have time to choose who you will be, Olivia. But today, in this moment, what you've done has consequences, and you will have to live with them. She cried silently as I stood and left the room. And in that instant I realized the deepest wound wasn't losing my son. It was watching my granddaughter lose herself along with him. When I realized Robert was collapsing and Olivia no longer had the strength to keep up the facade, I knew Carmen would not give up. A woman like her only retreats when there is no ground left to stand on. And indeed, it didn't take long for her next move. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. As I watered my roses, I noticed eyes watching across the street. Mrs. Parker, who always greeted me, quickly looked away. Mr. Johnson waved, but without his usual firmness. The air was heavy, as if rumors were already spreading from house to house. Shortly after, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Miller, distressed. Theodora, I need to warn you. Carmen stopped by some houses yesterday. She said you've gone crazy, that you forged documents and want to expel your own son. She's trying to turn the neighbors against you. My stomach churned. It wasn't enough that she wanted to steal my house. Now she was trying to steal my reputation too. I decided to go out and confirm with my own eyes. I walked to the corner, where two neighbors were speaking in low voices. When I approached, they stopped abruptly. Is it true you kicked Robert out? One of them asked, almost whispering. I looked at her firmly. I didn't expel anyone. I only defended myself against fraud. I have official documents to prove it. The two exchanged glances, visibly uncertain. Carmen had planted doubt, and now I had to uproot the poison before it spread. By late afternoon, I heard cars pulling up. Carmen arrived accompanied by two friends. They came in laughing loudly, as if preparing for a spectacle. They walked into the living room without even asking permission. Take a good look, girls, Carmen said, raising her voice. This is the drama queen. She invented that we're criminals just so she doesn't have to admit she's lost her mind. My hands trembled, but I breathed deeply. I knew what was at stake was no longer just the house, but my honor before the community. And in that moment, I made my decision. I would not let Carmen tell the story in my place. I myself would reveal the truth before everyone. The next morning, I invited some neighbors for a conversation on the porch. I made sure to invite Mrs. Miller, Mr. Johnson, and even the hesitant Mrs. Parker. When they arrived, I served fresh coffee and cookies, just like in the old days when the neighborhood gathered in my home. The atmosphere was tense, but familiar. Good morning, I began loudly, looking each one in the eye. I want to clarify the stories that have been going around. They said I forged documents, that I am losing my sanity. Well then, here is the proof. I carefully opened my folder and laid the papers on the table. The deed notarized by the county notary, the official certificate from the county clerk, statements from the bank. Each sheet passed from hand to hand, and I saw the looks changing, from skepticism to indignation. Carmen arrived unexpectedly, accompanied by Robert and Olivia. She found the group gathered and went pale. What is this? An assembly against me? She mocked, trying to keep her pose. No, Carmen, it is only the truth in broad daylight, I replied firmly. She lifted her chin, her voice shrill. Don't believe her. She's manipulating you. She's always been a bitter woman, unable to accept that the family moved on. But Mrs. Miller didn't hesitate. "Carmen, I myself witnessed when you spoke about declaring her incompetent. I heard your threats. Enough lies." Mr. Johnson stepped in as well. "Using forged documents against your own mother-in-law is a crime, and spreading rumors to stain her reputation? The neighborhood won't tolerate it." Robert lowered his head, defeated. Olivia cried silently, unable to face anyone. Carmen, cornered, still tried. "You don't understand. This house should have been ours. It's unfair that an old woman lives alone in all this space." A murmur of disapproval spread through the group. Mrs. Parker, who had remained neutral until then, raised her voice for the first time. "An old woman alone? No, Carmen. Theodora is part of our community. And if you don't respect her as your mother-in-law, we respect her as our neighbor and friend." The words fell like a hammer. Carmen stepped back, and I understood that I had regained something even more valuable than my walls: dignity before everyone. The day after the meeting with the neighbors, the atmosphere of the house was irreversibly changed. There was no longer room for excuses or pretenses. The masks had fallen. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I slowly descended the stairs, feeling each step like a victory. The creak of the wood seemed to announce the time had come. In the living room, I found a nearly grotesque scene. Boxes piled in every corner, open bags revealing wrinkled clothes, old photographs scattered across the floor like remnants of a broken life. Robert carried 2 boxes, sweat dripping down his forehead. His shoulders hunched, as if each object were also a burden of guilt. Olivia struggled to drag a suitcase larger than herself, sniffling between sobs. Carmen paced with arms crossed, her face tight, still trying to keep the posture of someone who hadn't lost. "You have until noon," I said calmly but firmly, letting my voice fill the room. "After that, anything left will be considered abandoned trash." Carmen laughed, but the sound was false, metallic. "Let it be clear, we're leaving of our own will. No one is expelling us." Her words rang hollow, like glass about to crack. Robert remained silent. He avoided my eyes like a punished boy, but his tearful gaze betrayed the weight of shame. Olivia held a framed photograph from when she was 6 years old. She was on my lap, smiling with a birthday cake. Tears fell on the glass. "Grandma, will you ever forgive me?" I breathed deeply, fighting against compassion. "Forgiveness doesn't come from tears, Olivia. It is earned through choices, and you still have a whole life to prove who you really are." Shortly before noon, they all gathered at the door. Suitcases, boxes, and bags formed a disorderly pile in the front yard. The taxi waited at the gate, engine running, as if the whole street awaited this ending. Robert turned one last time, his voice choked. "Mother, I just want you to know, I still love you." I kept my face serene, my spine straight. "True love does not plan betrayals, Robert. What you called love was convenience." Carmen was the last to leave. Before crossing the gate, she cast me a look of hatred. "This house will be too big for you, Theodora. You'll die here alone." I looked straight at her, holding the doorknob like someone sealing a vow. "I prefer solitude to dishonor, Carmen, and this house will never be too big because it is filled with true memories." The door closed behind them with a snap that echoed through the structure, and for the first time in a long while, the silence inside the house was mine. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea. The steam rose slowly, filling the air with the same fragrance my mother used to prepare when I was a child. Each sip felt like returning to her lap, as if she were whispering, "You won, my daughter." I stood up and walked through each room. The walls seemed brighter. The windows let in a sunlight I hadn't seen in months. There were no longer hurried footsteps echoing through the hallways. No whispered voices plotting in the shadows. Only the soft ticking of the clock and the sound of my own breathing. I touched the curtains I had sewn myself, ran my hand over the wooden table where I had served countless Sunday meals, held photographs that had once been the target of disdain. Each object had regained its true meaning. In the garden, my roses were in full bloom, red, intense, almost defiant to anyone who dared call them ugly. I bent down to water them and breathed in the sweet fragrance that filled the air. I smiled to myself, remembering Carmen's words. These plants are just work. These flowers had endured storms, frosts, and scorching summers, just like me. The phone rang. It was Dr. Harris, the notary. Mrs. Williams, just confirming, your documents are all in order, and if you wish, we can register additional legal protections. Thank you, doctor, but I believe I've already regained what matters most. That night, I lay down without fear. For the first time in months, there were no voices conspiring behind the door. Silence was no longer a threat. It was peace. The house breathed with me, whole, free. I then understood the greatest lesson. Age is not a synonym for weakness. 70 years had not turned me into a victim, but into the guardian of my own story. Love, when blind, can be used against us, but when steady, it saves us. As I closed my eyes, I knew that nothing, not even solitude, would ever be worse than living surrounded by lies. I had regained not only my house, but also my dignity. And if you have followed this story until the end, I want to ask you, what would you do in this woman's place? Leave your comment, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to follow the next ones. It is your voice that gives life to every testimony like this.